A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. We really like to complain about the world, don't we? You open any news app in April 2026, and it feels like the wheels are coming off the wagon. But today's prompt from Daniel hits us with a reality check that is actually kind of hard to wrap your head around. He's asking when the most peaceful and war-free period in human history was. And Herman, I have a feeling the answer is going to annoy a lot of people who think we're living in the end times.
It is a total paradox, Corn. If you look at the headlines, you see Ukraine, you see the Middle East, you see the horrific situation in Sudan. But if you look at the spreadsheets, and you know I love a good spreadsheet, the data tells a story that completely contradicts our gut feeling. By the way, before we dive into the blood and guts of the data, a quick shout out to Google Gemini 3 Flash for powering our script today. It is helping us navigate some pretty heavy numbers.
It's interesting how we define peace, right? Because Daniel's prompt asks for the most peaceful period. Usually, when people think of that, they imagine some idyllic past. Maybe hunter-gatherers frolicking in a field, or some ancient golden age where everyone just got along. But you're telling me that's a myth.
It is the ultimate historical myth. If you look at the work of archaeologists and anthropologists studying pre-state societies, long before there were kings or borders, the rates of violent death were astronomical. We're talking about 15 to 25% of all males dying from human-on-human violence. To put that in perspective, if we had those rates today, we'd be seeing hundreds of millions of deaths every single year. So, the peaceful savage idea is out. Then you look at the big empires like the Pax Romana. Sure, it was stable inside the borders of the Roman Empire for about 200 years, but that peace was bought with the literal crucifixion of anyone who disagreed.
So peace, back then, was basically just a very successful protection racket. I won't kill you as long as you pay me, and don't move.
Well, not exactly, but you've hit the nail on the head. It was enforced stability. But if we want to find the true statistical nadir of war, the point where your individual chance of dying in a conflict was the lowest it has ever been in the history of our species, we have to look at the period between 1945 and roughly 2014. This is what historians call the long peace.
1945. So, basically, we had to almost destroy the entire planet in World War II before we decided to take a breather.
It sounds cynical, but that's exactly what the data suggests. The sheer scale of World War II 50 to 70 million deaths created a trauma so deep that it fundamentally rewired how nations interact. We went from a world where great power war was a regular summer activity to a world where the two biggest kids on the block, the US and the Soviet Union, never actually fired a shot at each other directly for nearly 50 years.
But wait, I have to push back there. We call it the Long Peace, but that period included the Korean War, Vietnam, the Soviet-Afghan War, and countless proxy battles in Africa and South America. How does that qualify as the most peaceful time?
This is where the metrics matter. We have to look at battle deaths per 100,000 people. If you look at the total global population, which was exploding during the 20th century, the percentage of people dying in war plummeted. The Uppsala Conflict Data Program, which is basically the gold standard for this stuff, shows that even with those proxy wars, the intensity was nothing compared to the Napoleonic Wars, the 30 Years' War, or the World Wars. In the 19th century, you had massive set-piece battles where tens of thousands died in a single afternoon. In the Long Peace, war became localized. It became small.
So it's a shift in scale. We stopped trying to delete entire civilizations and started fighting over individual zip codes.
Right. And there are very specific mechanical reasons for this. It wasn't just that humans suddenly became nicer or more evolved. There were three main suppressors that kicked in after 1945. The first, and most obvious, is nuclear weapons, mutually assured destruction.
The nuclear peace hypothesis. It's the ultimate don't make me come back there from the universe.
It really is. Nuclear weapons changed the math of war. For thousands of years, a king could look at a neighbor and think, if I win this war, I get more land, more gold, and my life stays pretty much the same. With nukes, the winner dies too. The profit motive for war between major powers vanished overnight. You can't enjoy your conquered territory if it's a radioactive wasteland and your own capital is a crater.
It's wild to think that the most destructive invention in history is the primary reason we haven't had a third world war. It's like we built a fence out of landmines, and now we're surprised the neighbors aren't trespassing.
It's a terrifying kind of stability. But the second suppressor is actually much more optimistic: economic interdependence. This is the McDonald's peace theory, though it's much deeper than fast food. Modern supply chains are so integrated that starting a war is like reaching into your own chest and trying to pull out your own heart. If China and the US went to total war tomorrow, the global economy wouldn't just dip, it would cease to function. The computers wouldn't work, the phones wouldn't charge, and the food wouldn't move. The cost of war now vastly exceeds any possible gain from conquest.
I like that one better than the nukes. We're too busy making money to kill each other. Feels like a much more sustainable model for the long term. But what about the third one?
The third is the institutional layer. The United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the international treaties. People love to mock the UN as a toothless talking shop, and in many ways it is. But what it provides is friction. It creates 1,000 bureaucratic steps between "I'm mad at you" and "I'm launching a tank division." By the time you get through the Security Council meetings and the sanctions and the diplomatic cables, the hot-headedness often cools down. It's a system designed to slow things down.
So we've got a combination of we'll all die, we'll all go broke, and we're buried in paperwork. It's not exactly a Hallmark movie version of peace, but I guess I'll take it.
It worked incredibly well for about 70 years. If you look at the first decade of the 21st century, 2000 to 2010, that was the absolute nadir. Statistically, that was the safest time for a human being to exist on this planet since the dawn of time. Battle deaths were at historic lows. Even with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the global death rate from conflict was tiny compared to any other era.
But Daniel's prompt mentions the date, and we're sitting here in 26. Does the data still hold up today? Because it feels like that long piece is getting a little frayed at the edges.
That is the big question, and it's where the long peace proponents like Steven Pinker are getting a lot of heat. Since 2014, and especially since 2022, the numbers have started to trend in the wrong direction. The Peace Research Institute, Oslo, reported that 2024 and 2025 saw a massive spike in state-based conflicts. We're talking about 61 active conflicts across 36 countries. That's the highest number since the end of World War II.
61? That's a huge jump. So are we witnessing the end of the most peaceful era? Is the bubble bursting?
It depends on how you look at the stats. If you look at the number of conflicts, yes, the world is much more noisy and violent than it was in 2005. But if you look at the total number of deaths, we are still nowhere near the levels of the mid-20th century. Even with the high-intensity combat in Ukraine and the brutal toll in Gaza and Sudan, the global battle death rate is still lower than it was during the height of the Cold War proxy fights.
So we're in a high-noise, medium-casualty era.
We're seeing a great fragmentation. The big suppressors are still holding back a total global meltdown. We haven't had a nuclear exchange, and the global economy is still limping along, but the new peace of the 90s is definitely over. We're seeing the return of territorial disputes. Countries are testing the boundaries again because they perceive the international order as being weaker.
It's like the teacher left the classroom, and now the kids are starting to throw erasers, but they're still too scared to actually set the building on fire.
That's a good way to put it. But we have to talk about the fat tail problem. This is something Nassim Taleb talks about. He's a big critic of the idea that we've become more peaceful. His argument is that war isn't like height or weight, where everything stays within a predictable range. War is more like an earthquake or a stock market crash. You can have 100 years of silence, and then in one afternoon, you lose everything.
Right. Just because it hasn't rained in a month doesn't mean you've solved the problem of rain. It just means you're in a dry spell.
And Taleb argues that the long peace is just a long statistical fluke. He says that because our weapons are so much more powerful now, the potential for violence is at an all-time high, even if the actual violence is low. It's like saying a room full of gasoline is peaceful because no one has lit a match yet.
That is a much darker way to look at my landmine fence analogy. So, in this view, the most peaceful period isn't actually peaceful. It's just a period of extreme tension that hasn't snapped yet.
It's a debate between the Better Angels camp, who think we've fundamentally changed our culture and institutions to prefer peace, and the Black Swan camp, who think we're just lucky. But if we stick to Daniel's question about the fewest wars happening, the answer really is that 1990 to 2010 window. That was the sweet spot. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The US was the undisputed hegemon, and global trade was expanding into every corner of the earth.
It was the end of history era. Everyone thought we'd just be trading stocks and arguing about internet speeds forever.
And for 20 years, we basically were. But history has a way of coming back. What's interesting about the current uptick, the 2024 to 2026 period, is that it's not being driven by the great powers fighting each other directly. It's being driven by middle powers and non-state actors. You have groups like the Houthis disrupting global shipping, or regional powers like Iran, Turkey, and Russia trying to carve out spheres of influence. The monopoly on violence that the US and its allies held is dissolving.
So the peace is becoming decentralized. We don't have one big peace. We have a bunch of small, localized wars that the big guys can't, or won't, stop.
And that brings us to the future. If we're looking at what could disrupt this equilibrium further, we have to look at things like AI and cyber warfare. We've been talking about battle deaths, which is a very 20th century way to measure war. But what if the next war doesn't involve a single bullet? What if someone just turns off the power grid in a rival country, or uses AI to collapse their financial system?
If no one dies on a battlefield, but 1 million people die in hospitals because the power went out, does that count as peace in your spreadsheet?
That is the terrifying loophole in the data. Our metrics for peace are very kinetic. We count bodies. We don't necessarily count the structural violence of a society being dismantled from the inside out. This is why some people are skeptical of the long peace narrative. They say, sure, fewer people are being bayoneted, but look at the rise in mental health crises, economic despair, and digital surveillance.
I think that's a bit of a stretch, though. I'd much rather be stressed out on Twitter than be bayoneted in a trench in 1916. We have to be careful not to both sides, peace and war. War is a very specific, visceral horror.
I agree with you there. The physical absence of war is a massive human achievement. We shouldn't downplay how incredible it is that most people alive today will never see a soldier in their hometown. That is a luxury that almost no one in human history had before 1945.
So, if we're looking for a practical takeaway here, it's that peace isn't the default. It's not like the weather where it just happens to be sunny. Peace is an engineered product. We built it out of trade deals, nuclear silos, and boring international meetings. And if we stop maintaining those things, the default state of humanity, which is pretty violent, comes roaring back.
That is the most important lesson. If you look at the great fragmentation we're in right now in 2026, you can see exactly where the maintenance is failing. We're seeing the erosion of the World Trade Organization. We're seeing nations pull out of arms control treaties. We're seeing the economic heart being threatened by protectionism. When you stop trading, the cost of killing your neighbor goes down.
It's a bit of a use it or lose it situation. If we don't value the institutions that created the long peace, we're basically inviting the short war era to return.
And we're seeing that in the data. The number of state-based conflicts is rising because the punishment for starting a war has decreased. If you're a regional leader and you see that the international community is distracted or divided, you're much more likely to take a shot at that disputed territory you've always wanted.
So, while we are technically still living in one of the most peaceful eras in history, we're also living in one of the most fragile. It's like we're on the top floor of a skyscraper. The view is great, and it's much safer than living in a cave, but the higher you go, the more you have to worry about the structural integrity of the building.
And the wind is picking up. The case study of the Ukraine war is fascinating here. It's a high-intensity territorial war involving a nuclear superpower, exactly the kind of thing that should have been impossible under the long peace rules. But it has stayed regional. It hasn't triggered World War III. Why? Because the suppressors are still working, even if they're under immense strain. The fear of escalation is still there. The economic sanctions, while not stopping the war, have made it incredibly painful for the aggressor.
It's a stress test. We're seeing if the 1945 operating system can handle a 2026 virus.
Well, again, I shouldn't say exactly, but it is a stress test, and the results are mixed. The system is holding, but the peace is getting much more expensive to maintain. We're spending more on defense, we're dealing with more refugees, and we're losing the efficiency of a globalized world.
So, for everyone listening who feels like the world is falling apart, you're not entirely wrong, but you're also incredibly lucky. You are still, statistically, living in the golden age of human safety. We've just forgotten how bad the normal age used to be.
We have a massive juicy bits bias. We focus on the 61 conflicts because they are loud and tragic. We don't focus on the 140 countries that are currently at peace. We don't report on the fact that billions of people went to work today and didn't have to worry about an artillery shell hitting their house. That is the dog that didn't bark, and it's the most important story in human history.
I guess that's the problem with peace. It's boring. You can't make a blockbuster movie about a trade negotiation that successfully prevents a war, but you can make 10 movies about the war that actually happens.
Peace is the absence of events, and humans are terrible at noticing when nothing happens. But if we want to keep this most peaceful period going, we have to start paying attention to the machinery that makes it possible. We have to care about the boring stuff, the treaties, the trade routes, the diplomatic norms. Because once those are gone, the interesting times come back. And as the old curse says, you really don't want to live in interesting times.
Well, I, for one, am happy to be a boring sloth in a boringly peaceful era. Let's keep it that way.
I'm with you. Let's keep the spreadsheets boring and the headlines quiet.
All right. I think we've thoroughly dissected the long peace and why it's currently having a midlife crisis. It's a fascinating look at how we measure human progress. It's not just about what we build, but what we manage not to destroy.
It's the ultimate less is more metric.
Definitely. We should probably wrap this up before we find another 50 spreadsheets to analyze. Big thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping us on track. And a huge thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. We literally couldn't do this without that serverless magic.
If you found this dive into the data of peace interesting, do us a favor and leave a review on whatever podcast app you're using. It actually helps more than you'd think to get these weird conversations in front of new people.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and at myweirdprompts.com.
Stay curious and try to keep things boring out there.
See ya. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth.